Well, good evening and welcome to this installment of the Hagen History Center Spring 2022 Speaker Series. I'm Jeff Sherry, Museum Educator. Our speaker tonight is Courtney Baran of Courtney Baran Historical Consulting. Her talk tonight is entitled Brewing Up History in Erie County. Beer is the drink of America. Before I turn it over to Courtney, just a few announcements from the Hagen History Center. We are currently open to the public 6 days a week from 10 to 5, featuring new exhibits in the Watson Curtsey Mansion, the Wood Morrison House, and the Frank Lloyd Wright office, his original office in San Francisco, and other architectural exhibits in our brand new exhibit building. Our staff has created many blogs and videos that are available on our website at www.eriehistory.org, and we encourage you to check those out regularly. Courtney Baran is a graduate from Indiana University of Pennsylvania with a master's degree in public history. Has lived in Erie for 5 years. She is a digital collections librarian for the Erie County Public Library, and she also owns a historical consulting business where she specializes in private and oral history projects and historical documentation and digitization. Brewing beer has a rich history nationally and locally. Tonight, we'll learn about the history of the beverage and how the beer industry influenced Erie County history. Courtney?
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Jeff. And thank you for having me here tonight. I'm really excited to talk about the history of beer in Erie with everyone. Food history and beverage history is one of my favorite topics to research so far, and this topic specifically has been my favorite to date. But before we start diving into Erie specifically and its local beer history, I do think it's really important, especially when talking about food history, to understand the history of the item as a whole, to understand where it came from and how it came to be. So let's go ahead and get started here. So we've all heard about that magical time of day, and it's called beer o'clock. And honestly, it has been around forever. As long as people have been making bread, it can be assumed that beer was just being made right next door. Due to the fermentation process of the yeast, the two would actually benefit from being located next to each other, because the byproducts of the bread making would be used to create that bubbly fermented beverage. In some sense, beer would be considered an accidental drink because grains would be left out from the milling process of making bread, and it would be put in a jar, set aside, water would get in it, it would get hot, and it would start to ferment and gradually turned into the alcoholic beverage. This beer making process is estimated to date back to the times of the Mesopotamian era, which is located approximately where modern day Iran is. I do have to note that women were the original brewmasters. Since women were in charge of making bread, they were also responsible for tending to the beer as well. The women's roles in producing beer continued on for centuries, but it did eventually shift to a heavily male-dominated field, which we'll discuss later. But females really led the way for that iconic beverage. So way to go, ladies. Beer making wasn't just in this region, though. It expanded to surrounding areas. And there are even depictions of beer making on pyramid walls. The image that's on the screen right now is of a wood carving model of ancient Egyptians creating beer. So it's been around for a long time. Back in these times, there were other fermented beverages that were being made, including wine and mead. These drinks, however, were tended to be drank by people of higher status. Beer is more so what I would call a people's drink, and it was drank by your everyday person. But beer was so important of a beverage that there was actually a Sumerian patron goddess of beer known as Ninkasi. And that not only demonstrates how important beer making was to these civilizations in these regions, but also demonstrates how it is predominantly female led since it is represented by a female patron goddess. And the love of beer quickly spread across the globe, especially as traveling and trading increased over time. In Asia, Muslim traders actually introduced the area to the beverage, and it quickly became an obsession in the area. There have been pots that have been found that are over 5,000 years old that still have the residue of beer making process on them, which I think is really cool personally. In Africa, beer was being made heavily in jungle regions due to the weather conditions. It was perfect conditions for a quick fermentation process. But rather than using grains necessarily, many of the beers made in this area were made from a mashed banana base. So rather it being a grain-based beer, it would be a fruit-based beer. Personally, I would consider Europe to be kind of the powerhouse of the beer making process and creating the drink that we really know of today. In Europe, beer was treated similarly as in the Mesopotamian era, and it was drank by people of a certain class. But rather it being like the everyday people's drink, in Europe, the barbarians or like the Vikings were actually the ones who drank beer. It wasn't really meant for anybody else at that time. But I do need to add a little side note about what beer was back then. Yes, it was an alcoholic beverage that was created with fermented grains, but it's a lot more bitter and it wasn't typically filtered, and it's definitely not as pleasant as that nice cold brew sounds today. Germans were actually responsible for creating the brewing method that took out that extreme bitterness of a beer. So after the brewing methods and techniques were fine-tuned and it was a little more enjoyable, more and more people began to drink the beverage. But that's why originally upper class or more sophisticated people didn't drink beer at first. Beer was also used in Europe originally, like that fermentation process was used to preserve grains before winter time. So yes, it was a drink, but it did have other purposes, and that process had other purposes as well. The traditional Pilsner beer that we all know of today was developed back in 1842 in Europe, and it's now mimicked around the world. It kind of created that standard. And after this creation, beer was starting to be flavored with fruits and with hops, which started to help establish those different beer types that we've come to know of today. Even after this, though, beer was still extremely regional in its consumption patterns. Germany is probably one of the first countries that comes into mind when we think of beer, and it's completely accurate. Like I said, it was kind of where that beer making process started. But Bulgaria and the Czech Republic region were also extremely popular. Another less likely region is some areas of France, which was known to consume a lot of beer through cooking and drinking. But if the regions that were more common were the ones that were along the border of Germany. So it made sense. They were right next door. They kind of shared what they knew. So rather than wine, a lot of those countries along or cities and whatnot along the border would drink beer more so. I do have to add, though, that Europe was actually where women were removed from the beer making process and industry as well. Many women were making the beverages not only for their households and for their families and neighbors, but they were earning some extra cash and had a little bit of a side hustle going on. They were really making businesses out of it. And during the 16th century, people did not like that, and some men were starting rumors that women who brewed beer were witches. You can see in the picture that's on the screen, the hat, they would have these big cauldrons that they would stir their potions in. So women started getting these stigmas of brewing beer. And while the rumors did spread, not many people actually believed the rumors, but it was decided that women needed to do something better suited for women, whatever that may be. And women were starting to be told they could not do beer making anymore. And in the 1500s, it actually became illegal in some English cities for women to even brew the beverage. So Europe was not only the place of where modern beer came to be, but it was also home to where women were removed from the process. All right. Moving right along to our next global stop is Latin America, which was also known to make beer, but fermented corn was really the staple ingredient. This corn-based beer was known as chicha, and it's actually still made today. On your screen, that picture on the left is a picture of what chicha looks like. It can be made in an alcoholic and non-alcoholic form, and it originated in the Andes and Amazonian regions, and it was actually being made pre-Spanish conquest times. So there wasn't even any sort of European influence, yet people were finding a way to create a beverage similar to beer. Chicha was made by women would take sprouted corn, they would chew on it, spit it into a leaf, put it into a jar that had milled corn and water. It would ferment, they'd cook it down, and a beverage was made. So once again, women are kind of the powerhouses for that. Today in Latin America and in South America and whatnot, cerveza is still just as popular in the areas, with brands such as Corona, Dos Equis, and Modelo still being viewed as very popular beer brands from this region. And then we're going to make our final global stop here in the North American region. And I think it's safe to say that Americans have proved that they truly love their beer. And it's by far one of the most consumed beverages in the country. Compared to places such as England, a while ago, where only men really drank beer, because that did shift and transition. In America, men, women, and even at some point children were drinking beer. I mean, it was so popular. In colonial times, they would use anything that they could find. They would make beer out of vegetables, tree bark, fruits, herbs, spices. If they could possibly ferment it, they were trying to make beer. That's how much they loved it. And this love of beer continued on and didn't stop even during the Prohibition era. Beer production and consumption was so important that even gangsters like Al Capone's posse would fight and kill individuals over who gained control of the breweries, because they could not go without that awesome cold brew. So as promised, we're going to move along here, and we're going to start talking about beer in Erie. Here in Erie, history shows us that the beverage was extremely popular here too. Similar to our grape growing climates and the soil here in Erie, the growing of grains, especially barley and whatnot, were also super successful. I've got this article up now that was from Erie Illustrated, and it talks about the brewing business and how it was so successful in Erie. Not only just from the industrial standpoint, but also the growing of the grains and whatnot as well. And on top of this, and our industrial, one too many. And on top of our industrial landscape, we really had a great environment for brewing to take off. And we not only had the buildings and the structural capacity for it and the train traffic, if you think about importing anything that was needed, but we were also able to produce a lot of the materials locally, such as bottles and the other things that were needed. This image here is of Wayne Brewing Company, which is one of the more popular and well-known ones in Erie. And I wanted to include this picture because it just shows how big this operation was and how big these breweries were for the time. They were not small scale, and everything was housed in one area. So that really helped with the impact and its growth here in Erie. The heavy German influence of like the German immigrants that were coming to the area also helped with the industry and it increasing as well, because, you know, Germany really perfected that beer making process. So they were bringing their knowledge over to help this production. The first known fully established brewery in Erie was opened in 1815, and it was called Erie Brewery. And that stayed in business until 1843. Starting in the 1840s, though, Erie sees a large increase in the amount of breweries in the area. At times, there were almost 15 at one time. There were a lot in the area. And in 19, we're really far off, 1875, some of the major, more well-known breweries, brewing companies in the area were Eagle Brewery, Ale Brewery, National Brewery, and Kohler Brewing. In 1899, there were some major movements in the beer industry here, though. There were several large contenders for specifically that were really kind of left in the area by 1899. And they decided that they wanted to join forces and create one massive brewing company, which was called the Erie Brewing Company. This new brewery combined Fred Kohler Brewing Company, Eagle Brewery, Conrad National Brewery, and Cascade Brewery, which was formerly known as the West End Brewing Company. And this corporation was coming into business with a capital stock of $2.5 million, with the privilege of an increase of capital of $5 million. So they were coming in with some funds and substantial backing to create this company. And this merger was officially announced in the Erie Times News on February 20th, 1899. And what's on the screen right now is an advertisement of kind of all the different branches of the Erie Brewing Company. They did have a lot, but I picked these ones, this page specifically, because it had the Conrad branch, the Fred Kohler branch, and the Jackson Kohler branch. And I do have to note, this brewery in no way is affiliated with the Erie Brewing Company that's around today. The one that we're talking about today was in existence from 1899 until 1978. The Erie Brewing Company that's around today wasn't founded until 1993, and it was actually originally known as Hopper's Brew Pub. So just so if there's any confusion there, they are separate entities. After 1899, though, the amount of breweries in Erie were kind of scarce compared to its original numbers. At most, there were maybe 5 at a time, and almost all were part of brewery unions. Besides the Consumers Brewing Company, I have to note it, it was the only independent brewery in the region for a while. In 1917 and 1921, there were only 3 breweries listed in city directories specifically. And those were Erie Brewing Company, Anheuser Brewing, and Wayne Brewing Company. On the screen here, you're gonna see that I have 2 different city directory clips that I found. And on the left is from 1880, and you'll see the brewery and malt houses, and there are so many breweries listed for that year. On the right-hand side is from 1917. It really starts to go down, and there are some breweries listed, but they are bottlers specifically. So while those may have been breweries, there were also just people bottling beer. So we see that big decrease in breweries in the area. In 1828, Erie Brewing Company and Wayne Brewing were still listed in city directories, but they were now listed as soft drink companies rather than breweries. And as you can probably guess, this was from that infamous day that struck on January 17th, 1920, where prohibition was enforced across the United States. And breweries, including those in Erie, were hit hard. The amount of barley that was grown in the area decreased drastically to a point that it wasn't really even a thing after the prohibition, because there was a lack of consumption of the beverage in general and the need for it. And with the consumption of alcohol being illegal and the making of it, the reason breweries even survived that time period was by making malt beverages and other products. But even before the prohibition took place, though, there was a large majority of individuals in the area who believed that the sale of alcohol should be illegal. The Women's Christian Temperance Union were extremely active in this area. And even before they came around, there was actually an incident of 9 women who were very against this sales of alcohol, and they were very anti-saloon. They stormed a saloon in Wesleyville with axes. Like, they took the axes into the saloon and just started smashing all the whiskey casks that were in there. I can't imagine what the scene would look like. Based on the newspaper article describing the incident, I guess everyone was ankles deep in whiskey. And the acts of these 9 women actually helped influence the Carey Nation and their tactics to overcome the sale of alcohol, which I think is cool to see how a group of women semi-nearby influenced acts that went nationwide. Although kind of a crazy tactic, it worked, I guess. There was such a strong women influence of the WCTU and other anti-alcohol and anti-saloon groups up to and throughout and after the Prohibition. And there were actually several chapters throughout Erie County. And I laugh because I feel like these women would be in absolute shock if they knew that women were the ones who started the beer making process and kind of got this business up to where it is. So that just makes me chuckle. And while this group and other organizations were extremely influential in the decision making in the county, in the city, and nationwide eventually too, breweries here tended to be just a little more popular. And they also had an extreme influence on politics because they were a very successful industry in the area. Anti-saloon laws were being created and whatnot, but nothing could quite touch the breweries. The brewery industry always was able to gain just enough signatures or support they needed or funds that were necessary in order to push back any opposition. But eventually, the breweries were impacted by the Prohibition, and they had to think of a new plan fast. One plan that went into effect for Erie Brewing Company specifically was they changed the Kohler branch to an ice factory, actually. Erie Pure Ice Company was quickly started up, stocks were sold, equipment was put into there, gaining freezers and the ice making machines, water purifiers, just so they had another source of income to make it through this time period. As for other ideas to stay afloat, there was, as I mentioned, the production of malt beverages and sodas. And the rule of thumb with brewing or creating a malt beverage or a soda throughout the Prohibition was anything sold had to be under 3% ABV. Erie Brewing Company went extremely heavy into its production, and they started releasing Imperial sodas. Some of their flavors included birch beer, ginger ale, orange blossom, lime and lemon soda, and of course their famous brownie soda, which was chocolate flavored. And while I was able to do some research at the Hagen History Center, they had a wonderful archive and collection of brewery photos and documents and whatnot. I found some awesome photos that can clearly be identified from being during the Prohibition. This first one I wanted to share with you is of them bottling soda, specifically, as you can tell from the crates that they have, they were bottling up their brownie soda. Because these breweries already had the equipment necessary to bottle their own beverages because they were already set up for that, as I mentioned earlier. So transitioning into making these malt and soda beverages was relatively easy for them. This next photo, I really like. It's of the Kohler Brewing building, which used to be located on State. And you'll see the building, but up in the upper left-hand corner, you're gonna see their painted advertisement that says Drink Imperial. So they're advertising their sodas, specifically the birch, orange, lemon, and ginger ale. And I just think it's interesting to see this, that, you know, they had to shift gears. What typically would have been a beer advertisement for their latest brew or their most popular brew ended up having to switch during that time. And then this third photo is of a storefront window display. Oftentimes beer and other food products and beverages would be displayed like this. But this one specifically I liked because it is advertising their Imperial sodas. On the left and right hand side, you can see that they're promoting their Imperial Orange Blossom sodas. The middle sign in the middle says Imperial beverages, a drink for every taste. And on the left hand side of that is their pale dry ginger ale, and on the right is their lime litho, which is what they called their lime soda, and which I just thought was really fun. We can't pretend, however, that throughout this Prohibition era that everyone was completely straight-laced. We know that there were people still brewing beer. We know it was still being consumed throughout the county. People were just good at keeping everything on the down low, not getting caught, being sneaky, but not all the time. Some people got caught. And there was actually an incident in September of 1922 where some rebels were caught, and there was actually what they called a beer war at 4 Mile Creek Park. Every Labor Day, there was a large picnic that would take place. And in 1922, the festivities drew an estimated 30,000 people. And well, with such a large group of people partying it up on a holiday weekend during the Prohibition, you can probably take a guess at what happened. Yeah, there was the selling and consumption of liquor and beer from St. Mary's. And there was a drunken mob that was supposedly formed. There were individuals arrested. It was a whole scene. And there was an article written in the Erie Times the next day about how Erie should, and I quote, hang her head in shame over the terrible law-breaking acts committed. And if I had to put money on it, I bet the person who wrote that was part of one of the anti-saloon or anti-alcohol groups. But even through all of this, through transitioning, finding a new business method, getting caught, some people getting in trouble, eventually Prohibition did end. On April 7th, 1933, there was a huge celebration that beer was finally back in Erie. Thousands of people flocked to Erie Brewing Company, and when their doors opened at 12:01 a.m. that day, the party really got started. Let's be real. The newspaper article states from the Erie Times News that there were only 4 people arrested that night, which I think is pretty impressive considering how many people were there just to drink beer. People were just happy to be able to have the business back in Erie. And once beer was back, it did continue to grow for years to come. Erie Brewing Company really reigned supreme. There were other brewing companies around, such as Wayne's Brewing and whatnot, but the amount of beers, and especially that Kohler beer that is most well known, really set Erie Brewing Company apart. Throughout my researching, I did come across several fun articles about Erie Brewing Company specifically in Erie. One of my personal favorites is that Kohler Brewing was actually one of the original sponsors of the Erie Zoological Society. Back in 1965, Erie Brewing Company sponsored the Kohler polar bears exhibit, and part of their funding brought 2 polar bears to Erie from Germany. The zoo exhibit remained a home to polar bears until 2013. And the first male polar bear that was brought was actually named after Kohler beer founder Jackson Kohler. And the zoo kept the name for their second polar bear as well. And of course I have photos because I can't not share photos that I find. I get too excited. This first one is of the bears being transferred to the zoo, and they're driving past Kohler's brewing building, and they're on their Kohler truck. And it was said in the newspaper article that the captain and crew of the boat who brought them to Erie were extremely sad that day because they came to love the polar bears and thought they were kind of like their crew, which I thought was fun. This second picture is just of the polar bears in their new exhibit, hanging out, enjoying it. They did bring 1 male and 1 female. And as you can guess from that, a baby polar bear was born. This photo features a few of the Erie Brewing Company board members, as well as some others in the community, holding the newest baby polar bear that was born, Jackson Jr. So I thought that was super fun, and just something unique that we have here in Erie, or had here in Erie, I should say. Another fun story that I have is that a certain beer company, Yingling and Son, filed for an interference lawsuit against the Jackson Kohler beer, because they were stating that they actually copied their eagle symbol, and that was back in 1908. There was a letter transaction, the letter stating, "Hey, we're suing you because we think you stole our symbol." Few days later, the Erie Brewing Company's lawyer sends them a letter. They were not emailing back then. They sent a letter saying that they didn't think the case would stand and they didn't really have enough ground to stand on, and nothing really ever came about it. They got to keep their symbol. So I just thought that was interesting. And Erie Brewing Company and Wayne did stay in the area for quite some time. But unfortunately, all good stories do have to come to an end at some point. Wayne Brewing closed its doors first in 1951 due to too strong of competition from national brands. They were really starting to take off during that time, and the local companies just couldn't compete. Erie Brewing Company produced several different brands of beer, especially, like I said, that Kohler brand was really what kind of drove them through all of this. And it kept them afloat for a few more years, but it eventually closed its doors in 1978. And Kohler Brewing was actually sold to Schmidt Brewing Company out in Philadelphia. So it was still going to be produced, just no longer in Erie. And the picture that I have featured is actually of some of the last beer that was ever produced in Erie County of the Kohler beer. Which is sad. It's a bittersweet moment, I feel like, of seeing that industry leave the area. But have no fear. Kohler Brewing was still going to sponsor the Kohler Polar Bears exhibit, even with their transfer. And Erie Brewing Company's closure, though, was slightly unknown and a little vague. Meeting minutes were lacking a lot of information, but it can be assumed that they were facing financial troubles as well. They were facing a lot of pressure, like I said, from those big consumer national beer brands as well that were taking off. Molson and Labatt were some of them that really were putting some pressure on them. And after the closure of these two breweries, Erie's brewing scene was honestly almost obsolete for a couple of years. It really wasn't as popular, and we didn't really see much movement. But if you fast forward, the beer industry has really taken off again here in Erie, and it's kind of become an art form nationwide. Craft brews are readily available. Microbreweries are on the rise. This chart that I have up right now is from the Brewers Association of their data of beer consumption and production in the US. And so you can see that microbreweries are on the rise. People are learning how to make craft beers in their home again. Erie itself is home to the Lake Erie Ale Trail, and it currently has 13 members, and there's several more breweries popping up in the area as well. Nationally, women are finally making their way back into the arena and producing beers. The first female-owned brewery in the United States is owned by Carol Stout, Stout's Brewing Company. Didn't open until 1987, which if you think of when beer making became illegal for some women back in the 16th century, it took a really long time. And the first brewery owned by an African-American female wasn't open until 2000, and it was called Harlem Brewing Company, and that was founded by Celeste Beatty. So we're seeing that it's really taking a long time for women to get back into this industry. The Pink Boots Society was created as an organization to help empower female brewers in the United States. And in 2008, there were only 22 members, and now there's almost 2,000 members, and it's continuing to grow. And it's interesting when you look at history as a whole, they always say history repeats itself in some way, shape, or form. And that's kind of true with food history, especially with breweries. It started out really small. It started out with women brewing beer in their homes. The idea spread, more people liked it. It became huge. It became a huge corporate mass-produced thing. And now we see this trend of going back to small, people learning. I mean, people were getting all kinds of crazy hobbies during this crazy time with the pandemic. People are brewing beers again in their homes. Women are brewing beer again. We're even going back to that. We're going to local ingredients, small batch. And I just find it so interesting that we see breweries and beer production kind of returning to that trend. And I'm interested to see how it continues on in the future. But I barely scratched the surface today with the history of beer in Erie, its story. There's so much to learn, and I'm still learning so much too. And I hope to continue to expand on my knowledge of this because it's awesome. I have already topics in mind I want to research still. And I hope what I shared with you all today was interesting and you learned something new. If you have any questions for me, my contact information is up here. My business email is up there. You can also connect with me on Facebook and on Instagram. On that note, please go support your local breweries. I got to put a plug in for them. They're great here. I like many of them. I'm a true supporter of them. So go grab a beer there, enjoy that time and enjoy that beverage. And thank you so much to Jeff and to the Hagen History Center for having me as your speaker this month. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Courtney. Right now, we have no questions from Facebook, but I have a few questions or comments. As a historian, I've always read about something called small beer. What was small beer? Do you know?
I don't know exactly, but I'm gonna.
And they say it wasn't very good.
Yeah, I'm thinking it was kind of if it's similar to what I'm thinking of, kind of like hodgepodge beer that people would just try to like make beer and it wasn't actually beer.
Yeah, I know that early like 18th century or 19th century sailors were often issued small beer, in opposition to hard liquor like rum or whiskey in the American Navy. I find the role of women is fascinating. That they start this and then they lead the attack against beer. And I've always been struck by the fact that the movements in American history, women are involved heavily in the anti-slavery movement. And then they're involved in the right to vote, the suffragette movement. And then they're involved in the temperance movement. And I think it's fantastic. And I don't think a lot of people realize how much women have been involved in our history.
Yeah.
The history of,
honestly,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's honestly fantastic. And one of the things I hope to research more is Erie Brewing Company actually had a woman on their board of directors for a very long time, which I think is amazing because I don't think that was very common. But this beer process is, women are re-entering this history and their story needs to be told, which I think is really fun to bring out, especially in topics like this, because I don't think people think beer industry and think, oh, it's lots of guys brewing beer and hanging out. And it's like, no, that's not how it started. You can thank women for everything you know.
Well, there's this, this whole historical thing about cultural thing, women not drinking beer. And I don't think that's so much true. Prohibition, that's something you talk quite a bit about, and that had to really hurt the industry. And you made a good point about that, and how much people wanted it back. I have a reproduction pin that says "We want beer," from Prohibition, from the end of Prohibition, I think. So, it makes you think about that. Tell me a little more about the German role in this. I mean, the big brewer in Erie, Kohler. Everybody knows Kohler beer.
Mhm.
which is still made, but not, are they using the same recipe? I mean, or,
You know what? I wanted to do more researching in that, but I couldn't. I did email someone and they didn't get back to me right away. So
Mhm.
I don't know if they ever got it. But I don't know if it's the same. And I do know there is a brew pub in Grove City, I believe.
yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
Kohler Brew Pub, I think is what it's called. And they have lots of the original Kohler stuff there. I don't know if they're making the original recipes. But really, Germany, with the amount of immigrants that were coming to the area, especially in the 1800s, as I mentioned, Germany really fine-tuned that brewing process. They were coming up with the science more so of how to perfect a beer. And as people came and immigrated over, they started bringing that with them. And that's kind of what helped that process. The Kohler family itself, I don't know specifics on it, but the whole family itself was really involved in the beer industry. And so they helped bring over kind of those brewing methods in that process and easily get it transitioned in.
Well, growing up, I remember in the 70s and late 60s, I remember Kohler was advertising nationally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, the Uncle Jackson Kohler, they hired an actor and put big sideburns on him and, you know,
Yeah.
had him portray Uncle Jackson Kohler. And I saw a picture not too long ago of that actor with, I believe, some of the executives from the Kohler
Mm-hmm.
Brewing Company. Um, I think the polar bear story is fantastic. I don't know how many people realize
The
that.
Kohler polar bears. I
Polar
had no
polar,
clue
that's just
about it.
perfect. Perfect. Well,
Yeah, that one was so fun to find. And then, like I said, the Hagen History Center has wonderful archive collection of photos, and there was just photo after photo of the polar bears. I was so excited.
I may have missed. You said that they sponsored that for a long time. They're not, obviously there's no Kohler, so there's no connection anymore, right, to the polar bears
Yeah,
at the zoo.
correct. There's no
Mhm.
connection anymore. They ended up changing the exhibit. I believe they said now it's like the Lynx exhibit, it might be. They transitioned it into that. Because once their polar bear was transferred out in 2013, they had a single female polar bear who was elderly. She got shipped to North Carolina. And they just decided she was too old to move back. So
Mm.
once she was gone, the polar bear exhibit was gone. So it was the
That's
end of the Kohler polar era.
that's too bad.
Yeah,
Too
I
bad.
know. I was like, that would have been fun to see.
Yeah. Well, you know, the stigma of beer advertising with our bears, you know, you can't have that. You talk about the competition from national brands, and I know in some of the work I've done on, say, Mark's Toys, for example, that one of the things they couldn't compete with was, or wouldn't compete with, was the advertising from the bigger companies like Mattel, and then later the foreign companies. Was that pretty much the case here? They couldn't compete with Anheuser-Busch and Miller?
Yeah, they really just couldn't compete. I mean, those industries were, those companies specifically, they had huge production lines that made their costs way more efficient, and people liked it more. So it really just kind of set them apart. And if you look at Erie's kind of industrial footprint, anyways, the industry was kind of not decreasing yet, but like the end of the big industries in Erie were kind of coming to that phasing end.
Right,
And
right, in the
whatnot.
70s and 80s, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I think just a combination of that trend of the industrial era kind of ending here in Erie, along with those major competitions and that could produce at a much lower cost. I think that's just kind of what fizzled it out here.
No, I agree. I agree. We did have one comment from a Facebook viewer who said, "Great photos,"
Ah,
and I agree.
Hagen
And
History Center.
if you make an appointment with the Hagen History Center, you can come in and see some of those. But please do make an appointment. Courtney, I want to thank you and all of you who watched online for a fantastic talk. And it's a topic near and dear to my heart, and yours too, I can tell. So
Yes, I love
I
it.
think
So
a lot of our viewers as well. Our next talk is on can't be October, February 2nd, excuse me, October, February 2nd, 2020 at 7 p.m. when Erie resident and board member at the Hagen History Center, Gwendolyn White, will present Traveling Through Time, a history of her family's rich genealogical history. Courtney, thank you so much for presenting tonight. You did a fantastic job. Thank you. What a great topic. Hope to have you speak again for us.
Oh, awesome. That'd be great.
Well, thank you again, Courtney, and thank you for all of you who watched. Good night, everyone.